and I had just brought life into the world. 7 tiny lives. 7 perfect, breathing, crying miracles. But before I could hold them, before I could feel the weight of any of them against my chest, his anger came crashing down on me like a wave that wanted to drown me. They're all girls. His voice was laced with disgust, the kind that strips you of any dignity you have left. I turned my head toward the incubators, toward the rows of tiny pink faces scrunching and wailing. Their cries were like music to me, proof that they were alive, that they were here. But to him, it was noise, an irritation, a failure. He stood between me and them, his broad frame casting a shadow over the bed, as though even the light didn't dare touch me in his presence. "They're healthy," I whispered, my throat dry and raw from the effort of birth. They're useless." His voice boomed, drowning my words. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that daughters are not curses, that they are blessings wrapped in the softest skin, that they would grow to be fierce and brilliant, if only given the chance. But my body was too weak, my lips too heavy. I could only watch as the nurses hesitated, glancing between us like they weren't sure whether to hand me my babies or shield them from the man they had just seen strike their mother. NNHEY. Viewers, please tell me, where are you watching now? Hit the like button and subscribe to support my channel. So let's continue my story. N. Share Sid Brejard. Line Folteren, for Sid Brelteren Beastes. Please, let me hold them. Please, don't let their first moments be filled with this kind of hate. But my voice betrayed me, quivering into silence. Truth. This moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final drop in a bucket that had been filling for years. I had ignored the small cracks, the subtle words, the disappointed glances. I told myself, he's just stressed, or he'll come around. But as the heat of his slap spread across my cheek, I understood with painful clarity. He had been waiting for this. For proof that I had failed him. And in his mind, 7 girls was the ultimate proof. NNTHE nurse closest to me stepped forward, cradling one of my daughters in her arms. She had a small tuft of black hair sticking out from her head like a crown, and her tiny fingers curled and uncurled in the air, as though reaching for me. But before the nurse could place her in my arms, Arif's voice sliced through the air again. 9 was a time, take them back. It was like being stabbed without a blade. I had carried them for 9 months, every kick, every heartbeat, every dream. I had bled for them, fought for them, given my body over to the pain just to bring them here safely. And now, he was telling the world they didn't matter. NNTHE nurse hesitated, looking to me for permission, but Arif's glare was enough to make her turn back. My arms felt unbearably empty, the phantom weight of my child aching against my chest, and I bit my lip until I tasted blood. I would not cry in front of him, not now. But inside, a crack formed, deep and jagged. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment something in me began to change. This was the moment I stopped hoping he would ever love me for who I was, or love them for who they were. NNTHE sounds of my daughters' cries grew fainter as the nurses moved them to the far side of the room. I turned my face toward the wall, away from him, away from the shame and the rage twisting in his features. NNIN that moment, I made myself a silent promise. If he won't protect them, I will. If he won't love them, I will love them twice as much. And if he ever dares to harm them, I will stop him, even if it costs me everything. The slap had left its mark, not just on my skin, but on my soul. And though my body was broken from birth, my spirit began to sharpen that day. Because a woman who has nothing left to lose is a dangerous thing. When I first met Arif, it was at my cousin's wedding. He was dressed in a navy suit that looked like it had been tailored just for him, his smile easy and disarming, his laugh loud enough to draw the attention of every guest in the hall. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that made people lean in when he spoke, and I, young and naive, mistook that confidence for kindness. My parents had always warned me to look beyond the surface. But in that moment, I didn't want to. He spoke to me like I was the only person in the room, asking about my favorite books, my dreams, my childhood memories. It felt like fate when he proposed just 8 months later. My family wasn't wealthy, and his seemed like a step up in life. Educated, respected, financially comfortable. My mother pulled me aside before the engagement and said, "A charming man can make you laugh, but a good man will make you feel safe." I brushed her words aside. I was convinced I had found both in Arif. NNTHE, first months of marriage were filled with laughter, and the quiet thrill of learning each other's habits. He brought me flowers just because. We cooked together late into the night, and he'd tell me stories about his childhood. We talked about having children, and his eyes lit up every time he mentioned a son. My little soldier, he called him. I laughed along, never imagining that the dream of a son could turn into an obsession that would poison everything between us. When I became pregnant for the first time, Arif was attentive. He drove me to appointments, held my hair when I was sick, and massaged my swollen feet at night. I thought his love was unconditional, but the day our first daughter was born, I saw the first fracture, and it's a girl, the doctor announced, placing her in my arms. I felt my heart swell to a size I didn't know was possible. Her tiny eyes blinked up at me, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. But when Arif looked at her, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "She's beautiful," he said, but his voice had a flatness to it. Later, as we lay in the hospital bed together, he whispered, "Next time, it will be a boy." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I told myself it was just cultural expectations talking, that it wasn't his fault he wanted a son. I didn't see it as a warning. Years passed, and with each pregnancy my hope for a son, for his sake not mine, grew. Our second was a girl. Then the third. Each time, his disappointment deepened, his affection dimmed. By the fourth, the tension in our home was so thick that even my daughters began to sense it. They'd whisper in corners, asking me why Baba didn't smile as much anymore. I lied to them, telling them he was just tired from work. The truth was, he had started treating me like a failure. Not outright, not in front of others, but in subtle, cutting ways. Comments at dinner about trying harder next time. Ignoring me when I tried to share something good about the girls. Refusing to come to school events because, what's the point? I buried my hurt for years, telling myself I could endure it. After all, he never raised his hand to me, until that day in the hospital. But looking back now, I realized the abuse had started long before the slap. It had been growing quietly, fed by his resentment and my silence. The time I was pregnant with my seventh child, I could feel the unspoken pressure. My body was tired, my spirit worn thin, but I prayed for his sake that this would be the boy he wanted so badly. I told myself that if I could give him that, maybe the coldness would melt. Maybe he would see me again. Day, the doctor confirmed my seventh pregnancy. I sat in the parking lot for a long time before driving home. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind spinning with the same prayer over and over. Please, let it be a boy. Please, just this once. I hated myself for thinking that way, for even a second wishing for one child over another. But I was desperate. And as my belly grew, so did my dread. The ultrasound showed tiny limbs, a beating heart, a profile that made me ache with love. I wanted to ask the doctor about the gender, but part of me couldn't bear to know, until the moment came. Arif barely spoke to me during those months, except to make veiled comments about lucky number 7, and finally getting it right. My daughters, though, they were my joy. Every evening they'd sit with me, resting their small hands on my stomach, whispering to the baby inside. "We love you already," they'd say. "We'll protect you." Their innocence was a light in the darkness, and I clung to it. When the labor started, it was long and grueling. I remember thinking, this is it, this is the moment everything changes. But when the cries filled the room, and the doctor smiled gently and said, "She's healthy. She's beautiful," my heart swelled, and then shattered, and I didn't even have time to hold her before Arif's face twisted into rage. 7 girls, he said, like it was a curse. Didn't see the beauty in their tiny faces, the strength in their lungs, the promise in their futures. To him, they were disappointments, reminders that I had failed to give him a son. What he didn't know was that those 7 girls would become my reason for living, and eventually, the reason he would lose everything. Day after the birth, the hospital room smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. My cheek was still tender from the slap, but it wasn't the pain that kept me awake. It was the sound of my daughters crying in the nursery. I could hear them faintly through the closed door, their tiny voices calling for someone who would love them without condition. Arif hadn't returned since the night before. The nurses whispered about him when they thought I couldn't hear, their eyes flicking toward me with pity. Pity made me feel small, but worse than that, it made me feel powerless. I had 7 daughters who depended on me, and the man who should have been their protector had already shown he was their greatest danger. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind looping through every moment of our marriage. The charm that had swept me off my feet now seemed like a trick. The way he had treated each daughter's birth like a setback instead of a blessing now burned in my memory. And that slap. It was more than a blow to my face. It was a declaration that he saw me as nothing more than a vessel, a failed experiment that had outlived its usefulness. NNBY. The time the morning sun filtered through the blinds, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my life. Anger is dangerous when you don't know what to do with it. But I knew exactly what I would do. When Arif finally returned, his face was calm, almost smug. He brought no gifts for the babies, no flowers for me, only a bag with my clothes, and a look that said he expected me to thank him for the effort. "We'll go home today," he said flatly, and I said nothing. I dressed slowly, ignoring the ache in my body. The nurses wheeled the babies out one by one, their tiny hats color-coded so we could tell them apart. My arms ached to hold them all at once. But when I reached for the first one, Arif's hand closed over my wrist. "You'll tire yourself," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching with irritation. And I met his gaze, and for the first time I didn't look away. "They are my daughters. I will carry them if I have to crawl out of here." Something in my tone must have surprised him, because his grip loosened. I gathered the first baby in my arms, her warmth seeping into me like a promise. I didn't look at him again as I followed the nurse toward the car. On the drive home he ranted about what people would say. 7 girls, they'll think I'm cursed. They'll think you're cursed. And I let him talk. My mind was elsewhere, on the plan that was beginning to take shape. I had been silent for too long. Silence had allowed him to chip away at me piece by piece. But the births of my daughters had also given me strength I didn't know I had. NNIF. He wanted a war. I would give him one. But it wouldn't be loud or reckless. It would be careful. Precise. The kind of justice that doesn't just punish, it destroys. NNTHE. First step was survival. Arif had always controlled the money, the property, even the car keys. If I wanted to protect my daughters, I had to gain independence, without him noticing. That meant patience, something I had in abundance now. I started small. I took sewing work from neighbors, repairing clothes in the quiet hours after the girls were asleep. I told Arif it was just a hobby to pass the time. He didn't care enough to ask questions, as long as I stayed out of his way. I stashed the money in a jar hidden inside the hollow of an old pillow. The girls became my allies, though they didn't know the full extent of my plan. I taught them to study hard, to be resourceful, to keep secrets when necessary. One day, I told them, "You will understand why I'm teaching you these things." Over the years, I documented everything, every cruel comment, every instance of neglect, every time he failed to provide for them while spending money on himself. I collected witnesses without them even realizing it, confiding in a few trusted relatives and friends who promised to speak up when the time came. My breaking point had been the slap, but my moment of action came 3 years later. By then my eldest was 13, and I could see the fear in her eyes every time her father entered the room. That fear turned to silent defiance when she thought he wasn't looking, and I recognized it because it lived in me too. One night Arif came home drunk, a rare occurrence but dangerous when it happened. He shouted about the noise, about the dinner being cold, about everything and nothing. When he raised his hand toward my eldest, I stepped between them. "Touch her, and it will be the last thing you do," I said, my voice low but steady. NNHE laughed at me then, the kind of laugh that says, "You can't touch me." But he didn't hit her. Not that night. And that was when I knew he was starting to sense the shift in power. An NTHE final piece of my plan fell into place when I learned he had been hiding money, large amounts, from his business dealings. He thought I was too naive to understand bank statements, but I had been teaching myself quietly for years. I gathered the proof, kept it safe, and waited. Justice isn't always about the courts. Sometimes it's about dismantling a person's entire foundation until they have nothing left. And when the time came, I would make sure Arif understood exactly what it meant to be powerless. It was winter when the moment finally arrived. The air outside bit at the skin, the wind carrying the scent of rain. I had been patient for 3 long years, gathering every scrap of proof, every small victory, every hidden coin. My daughters had grown in that time, my eldest now 16, her chin lifted when she walked, her eyes sharp with the knowledge that her father's shadow could no longer bend her. NTHAT morning, Arif left for a business trip, or so he claimed. I knew better. He was meeting someone Someone who thought she was the only woman in his life. I had proof of that too. In another life, that might have been the betrayal that broke me. Now, it was just another weapon in my arsenal. I moved quickly. While he was gone, I packed our essentials: clothes, documents, the jar of money I had hidden away for years, the evidence of his financial secrets. My daughters moved silently, understanding without words that this was the day we had been waiting for. Even the youngest, barely walking when the plan began, now followed my instructions without hesitation. NNWE left the house like ghosts, locking the door behind us for the last time. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe him that. Now destination was a safe house run by a women's organization I had contacted months earlier. They had been waiting for my call, ready to help me start over. As we settled into the small but warm apartment, I felt the first true breath of freedom in years. NNTHAT night, I sent the evidence to his business partners, to his family, to the authorities. I sent copies of his bank records, proof of his infidelity, documentation of his neglect and emotional abuse. By morning, his reputation would be in shreds. The man who had spent years making me feel small would now feel the eyes of the community burning into him with shame. When my phone rang the next day, I recognized the number. I answered not with fear, but with steady calm. "Anne, you think you've won." His voice was hoarse, trembling with rage. "Anne, I don't think," I said. "I know. You've ruined me," he shouted. "No," I replied. "You ruined yourself. I just showed them the truth." And I hung up before he could answer. That was the last time I ever heard his voice. In the months that followed, the storm around Arif grew. His business partners dropped him, his accounts were frozen pending investigation, and whispers about his family troubles became open condemnation. The man who once stood tall in every room now avoided public places, afraid of the stares, the murmurs, the judgment. Meanwhile, my daughters and I began to build a new life. The safe house became our temporary haven, and from there we moved into a modest apartment of our own. I found steady work through the same organization that had sheltered us, and for the first time, the money I earned stayed in my hands. NNMY girls flourished in school. Without the constant tension at home, their laughter returned, filling the rooms with the kind of warmth I had dreamed of for years. I watched them grow into themselves, unafraid to speak, unafraid to be seen. One evening, my eldest sat beside me on the couch. "Mama," she said softly, "did you ever regret it, leaving him?" And I looked at her, at all of them, and felt the weight of the years lift from my shoulders. "No," I said. "I regret waiting so long. Justice didn't come in the form of a court sentence or a police raid. It came in the form of freedom. Freedom for my daughters to live without fear. Freedom for me to breathe without walking on eggshells." Arif's downfall was just a consequence. And I still think about that day in the hospital sometimes. The slap, the cries of my newborn daughters drowned out by his anger. But now, when I remember, I don't feel pain. I feel power. Because that was the moment I decided my story wasn't going to end in silence. Matu Nthe man, who once believed I was nothing without him, had been proven wrong in the most public way possible. And I had proven something to myself. I was more than a wife, more than a mother, more than the sum of my suffering. I was a survivor, a protector, and above all, the kind of woman who would burn down her past to give her children a future. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Justice doesn't always arrive quickly, but when it comes, it is relentless. It finds those who deserve it, no matter how long it takes.